So here we are, our last full class section before final exams. That's very exciting. At least very exciting for me, hopefully for you. Okay, so today we've already done course evaluation, so let's talk about some end of semester issues that you should be aware about. So the first thing is you need to be checking B courses to make sure that the grades that you actually got on your exam and your problem sets are properly recorded on B courses. Right? If there is a discrepancy and you still have a discussion section between now and our final exam, you can show that to your JSI and they can resolve the issue. If you do not have a discussion section between now and then, bring the problem set or exam that is incorrectly recorded to the final exam, and we will take care of it at that point. But please make sure that you check to make sure that what we have on B courses is correct, because that is how your final course grade will be determined. I'm assuming, of course, that you will tell us if your score was incorrectly recorded on the low side, and probably not if it was incorrectly recorded on the high side. Just an assumption, you can prove me wrong. Okay, final exam. As you know, exam number 3 is scheduled for Tuesday, December 16th from 11:30 to 2:30 in Wheeler Auditorium. That's a really weird hour. I don't have anything to do with setting this up. So if you don't have a late breakfast, be sure to have an early lunch to make sure you're fully nutritioned when you come in. The material that we will be covering is only the material that we've talked about since the second exam. So it will be chapters 13, 16, 17, 21, which we did on Tuesday, and the epilogue, which we will be doing later today. The format of the exam will be identical to what you've already seen. There will be 10 multiple choice questions and 2 analytical questions. Right? But again, the material is only what we've seen since what we did on exam number 2. And what that was chapter 13 was all about macroeconomic policy, primarily monetary policy. So this is where we talk about things like inflation targeting, time lags. The Taylor rule was all in this particular chapter. Chapter 16 was on fiscal policy. So we talked about fiscal policy in our standard model, but we also have fiscal policy issues, things like supply-side economics, supply-side payroll tax cuts, Ricardian equivalence. All of that shows up in that chapter. Chapter 17 was on exchange rates, and we talked about how exchange rates interact with the aggregate supply and demand model. So your problem set today hopefully answered any questions that you might have about how the model works with exchange rates. Let me just point out that we're doing it a little bit differently than the way it's done in the textbook. And that means that if you look at if you by any chance have access to some really old problem sets or exams, it may have been done a different way. So be cautious. What we did in the fall of 13 and the spring of 14 is the same as we're doing currently. Role of expectations, again, we did that on Tuesday. Ricardian equivalence, how that might work. I'll talk a little bit more about this a little bit later and in the epilogue. Now remember that all questions start from our standard aggregate supply and demand model. The standard aggregate supply and demand model does not include things like time lags, Ricardian equivalence, rational expectations, supply-side economics assumptions, right? Those are all controversial types of issues. If I want you to consider that in a problem, it will say so explicitly. So it might say something like the economy, which is characterized by blah, 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 and supply-side assumptions, or Ricardian equivalence, right? So it will be up front on that. So take your yellow highlighter when you're looking at the analytical questions, and if you see supply-side, Ricardian equivalence, rational expectations, or anything that gives you a hint, be sure to highlight it so that you won't forget to actually incorporate that. If I want you to deal with exchange rates, it'll be very clear that it's involving exchange rates. Right? So it'll say the economy is characterized by flexible exchange rate, fixed exchange rates, so forth. Okay? So basically our standard model is where we got to up to exam number 2. So that's something that you know, or hopefully you know. And now it's more bells and whistles that we've added on to it. As you know, the exam packet's going to look just like it has in the past. So it's going to be probably, haven't written it yet, so I don't know, but probably 14 or 16 pages long. It'll have scratch paper in it, so you don't need a blue book, you don't need scratch paper. We'll give you the entire exam packet. The exam itself will be closed notes, closed books, no electronic devices permitted, right? So you don't need to bring any of those things. If you do want to use an electronic language translator, like the previous exams, I need to see it first. So come up to me before the exam, make sure that it's turned on. If there are any memory card holders, make sure that those are open, so I can make sure that there's no memory card inserted. You will, of course, need your set of colored pens and pencils, black, red, blue, green, a yellow highlighter, not a pink one, not a blue one, not a green one, not a fuchsia one. Oh, not colors, but I know. Okay, yellow highlighters. Okay. Again, if you want to use a straight edge, an eraser, whiteout, any of those types of things, you can bring those as well. Again, this is you have up to 3 hours to take the exam. Does not mean that you need to take that long. But if you're one of those students who actually wants to take all of the time that's available to you to answer the exam, that's fine from our perspective. You may want to bring a little snack with you or something to keep yourself hydrated. There's going to be a lot of us in the room. It's going to get hot in there, so don't get yourself dehydrated while you're taking the exam. Nobody should be passing out from lack of water. Okay. When you have finished with the exam on Tuesday, I want to let you know I will not post the answers to the exam until Friday night. That's not because I have another macroeconomics class and they're taking the same exam. I do have another macroeconomics class and they're taking a completely different exam than what you're taking. I don't want you to worry about the answers and whether you got it right or wrong while you're still in the middle of exam week. So I never, ever, in any semester, post the answers to exam until exam week is over. Okay, so once you're finished with our exam, what do we know as economists? It's a sunk cost. Move on. All your variable costs and variable benefits are in the future. So once our exam's over, worry about the next exam that you have, not the ones that you've just completed. So you will not see the answers to this until Friday night. Okay, I will, once the JSIs have finished grading problem set 6 and posted those grades, so what happened for the entire class, I will redetermine everybody's weighted average score using their 5 highest problem sets in exam 1 and 2. Right? So the only thing will be missing will be exam number 3. I will post that weighted average on B courses so you can see exactly what your weighted average score is at that point. Now again, we're still going to be adding exam 3 before we figure out course grades. I will also email out a spreadsheet so you can see min, max, median, mean, standard deviation for your GSI and how that compares with all the other GSIs. Remember, grades are done by GSI, so don't worry about other GSI's grades. That'll give you an idea of your relative position in the course going into the final exam. So as I mentioned before, in the past, the median grade, median weighted average is a B, right? B as in boy. It might be a very high B, that is just below a B minus. It could be a very low B, just below a B plus, or it could be just above a B minus. But it'll be somewhere in the B range, right? So if you're 2 standard deviations above the median, there's a pretty good chance you're going to get an A in the class. If you're only a little bit above the median, chances are you're going to get a B, maybe a B plus, right? So think about where your relative position is, and if you're concerned about letter grades, that'll give you some indication of where you stand. However, keep in mind, final exams were 30% of your grade. 30% can change your position. You can change it a lot, in fact, if you do particularly well or if you do particularly poorly. So once we've got the final exam graded, and again for the entire class, so all, how many GSIs do we have? I don't know, 7, 8? All 8 GSIs have finished their grading. Then I'll recalculate weighted average scores, and then I will sit down and by GSI section allocate course letter grades. I will post on B courses a more detailed description of exactly how I do it, but the short answer is I look at, by GSI, I look at the weighted average scores of all the students in the 2 discussion sections, except for ET, who only has 1. I rank them from highest score to lowest score, and I start to look for where there are big breaks between the scores. Right? So what I'm looking for is students who have scores that are very close to each other are going to get the same letter grade. Students who have scores that are significantly different from one another are going to get different letter grades. Right? The same quality of work is going to get the same letter grade. Different qualities of work will get different letter grades. After I do that for all 8 GSIs, I also look across all 8 GSIs to see if the grading distributions are radically different. Is there a big outlier from the rest? And if there is, I look more closely to figure out why that's the case. In the past, there have not been dramatically big differences across GSIs. Now, if your best friend, your BFF, has a different GSI than you do, and you get exactly the same number of points, your weighted average score at the end is exactly the same, it is possible that you will get different letter grades. Remember, different GSIs can grade too hard, too easy, too meaning relative to the other GSIs. So we can only compare grades within a GSI's discussion sections, not across. I can make that comparison, but that's not a good comparison for you to make. As I mentioned, I've got a write-up on this. I'll post it on B courses, so if you want to worry about those kinds of things, you can worry about those kinds of things. What I suggest you do is worry about doing really well in the final exam. Okay, any questions on the final exam, where we are, what it's going to cover, how grades are determined, any of those types of issues? Okay, so we've talked about a lot. Oh, yes, ma'am. It's the lowest raw score, which, in my experience, has always been the lowest relative. Not always, but in my experience, it's the lowest raw score. Okay, so for the past 14 weeks, or 13 and a half weeks, we've talked a lot about macroeconomics. We've looked at a variety of different types of models. Some of our models were long-run models. Some of our models were short-run models. We've also talked about some controversies in macroeconomics, classical Keynesian divide being the most predominant one. So it often seems that when you think about the classical Keynesian divide, and especially if you read the op-ed page of major business newspapers or magazines, things like the Economist magazine or the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times business section or others, that you would think that macroeconomics is just in a huge state of disarray, that there's virtually nothing that we know or agree upon. And yet, I don't think that that is actually a true reflection. There is indeed a number of things that macroeconomists agree on. Now, when I say agree, I don't mean that we're unanimous on this. In every profession, there's always a couple of outliers, right? Those are the kooks and lunatics and the people who are contrarians. Who might also be kooks or lunatics, so it's not a exclusive set. Okay? So let's think about one of the things that we get very high agreement on in macroeconomics. So the first is that there is no long-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Another way of saying this is virtually all of us believe that the long-run Phillips curve is vertical. And remember, if the long-run Phillips curve is vertical, that also means the long-run aggregate supply curve is vertical. So in the long run, we think that the economy goes to its level of potential economic output, and that level is achieved irrespective of the rate of inflation. It could be high, it could be low, it could be in between, but the economy is still going to go to potential output. That's what it means to say in the long run that there's no trade-off. Massive agreement on that issue. The second thing that we can say has to do with that inflation, and that is that, again, in the long run, inflation is a monetary phenomenon. Inflation is determined by the central bank. So we saw this in a couple of contexts. We saw this in the long-run context with the quantity theory of money, that as long as the central bank can adjust for changes in velocity, changing the money supply will affect nominal GDP, but real factors will affect real GDP, so the only thing that's left to be determined is the rate of inflation. So in the long run, central banks control the rate of inflation. Well, we saw that even in the short run. In our short-run aggregate supply and demand model, one of the things that we saw, the rate of inflation that the economy achieves is largely determined by the Federal Reserve. Regardless of the types of shocks that hit the economy, aggregate demand shocks, short-run aggregate supply shocks, long-run aggregate supply shocks, the central bank can react in a way that keeps inflation very close to whatever target rate of inflation they would like to have. So whether it's in the short run or the long run, but particularly in the long run, central banks determine the inflation rate. Third major agreement. There are major benefits to price stability. Now remember, when we talk about price stability, what we're really saying is a low and stable inflation rate. We're not talking about no inflation, so no price change, but a low and stable inflation rate. And there is a fair amount of empirical evidence, that is, the data tell us, that when economies experience low and stable inflation rates, their long-run growth rate is faster than when they have high and variable inflation rates. Now, hopefully you recognize that statement as a violation of the classical dichotomy. Right? Inflation is a nominal variable. Nominal variables are not supposed to affect real variables in the long run. But the economy's long-run growth rate is a real variable. And the reason that this happens is that when inflation is high and variable, it raises issues of uncertainty about what the underlying inflation rate is. The Fisher equation says if we're uncertain about the inflation rate, we're also uncertain about interest rates, particularly nominal interest rates. Since most people, both consumers as well as business people, are risk-averse, more uncertainty leads to less, especially long-run investments. Fewer long-run investments means a smaller capital stock, the economy grows more slowly. When inflation is low and stable, there's more certainty. More certainty means there'll be more risk-taking by risk-averse individuals. So you'd end up with a larger capital stock, faster economic growth, higher level of economic activity. Now, there is a debate going on right now about how low should low and stable inflation be. One of the things that we've talked about is that most central banks have an inflation target of somewhere around 2%. But notice that we were roughly around 2% in 2007. The economy was hit by a very large negative aggregate demand shock. The central bank eased very sharply, and now we're at the zero lower bound. So one of the discussions that's going on is 2% inflation too low? Because it doesn't give the central bank enough downward movement of short-term interest rates before it hits the zero lower bound. Maybe rather than 2%, we should be thinking about 3%, or maybe even 4%. So remember, whatever the inflation rate is, add to it the real interest rate, now you've got the nominal interest rate. So if you're adding 1 or 2 percentage points to your inflation target, you're also going to be adding 1 or 2 percentage points to your neutral short-run nominal interest rate. That means that once you hit a large negative aggregate demand shock, there's more room for the central bank to bring nominal interest rates down before they hit the zero lower bound. So the discussion isn't, is price stability good or bad? The discussion is really, how low do we want low inflation to be? Now, in order to achieve price stability, a central bank needs to follow the Taylor principle. This does not mean they need to follow the Taylor principle every year. There are clearly times where the central bank needs to move away from the Taylor principle and actually have a discretionary monetary policy tightening or easing. Right? But over time, in order to keep inflation near its target level, whatever that target may be, the central bank needs to respond to changes in inflation by changing the real policy interest rate. Now, one of the things that we saw on Tuesday was that the data suggests that central banks that are more independent, and what we mean by more independent here is independent from political pressures from either the populace or the government, are more likely to achieve price stability. That is, if central banks adopt a primary objective of price stability, it's easier for them to do that as long as everybody else will get off their back. Which, of course, in part means that politicians and the public need to also need to recognize the benefits from price stability. Now, notice that in some cases that comes with some pain. Suppose, for example, that the economy experienced a sharp, negative, short-run aggregate supply shock. Short-run aggregate supply curve would move up, inflation would rise, the unemployment rate would rise. We've got a negative output gap. If the central bank wants to have price stability and not move away from its target, it actually needs to have a contractionary monetary policy. Move the aggregate demand curve to the left. Much deeper negative output gap, much higher unemployment, but lower inflation. So one has to recognize that having the independence sometimes actually means that the central bank doing the so-called right thing might actually make the economy worse off if we measure worse in terms of the unemployment rate rather than the inflation rate. Now, when we execute monetary and fiscal policy, it's possible for us to run into the so-called time inconsistency problem. Remember, the time inconsistency problem is doing the right thing in the short run, if we continue to do that for an extended period of time, may lead to the wrong results in the long run. So again, an easy way to think about that is a big positive aggregate demand shock, for whatever reason, we know is going to lead to higher inflation. So if, in fact, as we saw in your problem set, if monetary or fiscal policy does something, interest rates change, exchange rate changes, now net exports either augment or reduce the initial effects. So what gets done in the short run might be a positive outcome. What happens in the long run might actually end up being much more negative. So we have to be careful when we implement policy to keep in mind this time inconsistency problem. Yeah, let me give you another example. We already know from things that we've done before, the average recession in the United States is only about 11 months long. Now, it's 11 months long in part because typically we have monetary and fiscal policy response. Right? When the economy goes into recession, typically the Federal Reserve reduces the real interest rate, government increases expenditures on things like unemployment compensation, food stamps, they may have an infrastructure program, they might reduce taxes as well. But most of the economy is the private sector, and the private sector is going to get rebalanced and start to grow again. But if the Federal Reserve were to keep interest rates very low, if the government was to leave government spending at a very high rate, then not only would the private sector be